Why does church rock suck so much ass? I'm beginning to suspect that this is not merely a question of musical taste. I think it may be a legitimate theological emergency and a keyhole through which we can glimpse the entire psychological bottleneck of modern civilization. Why does musically supposedly written about the creator of the stars so often sound as though it was approved by a committee of assistant regional managers at a Christian furniture outlet? Why does a god who allegedly splits oceans, wrestled monstrous leviathans in the deep, overthrew empires, spoke through fire, descended into death, and came back carrying the keys so frequently receive the musical equivalent of a beige polo shirt tucked into a pair of khaki pants? The guitars rise. The drummer begins a legally permitted amount of pounding. Some handsome youth pastor closes his eyes and informs me that the mountains are high, that the oceans are deep, and God loves you very much, while the whole production possesses less spiritual danger than a coupon for 10% off at Applebee's. What happened to the thunder? What happened to the teeth? To the kind of sacred encounter that could rearrange a human nervous system, crack the false king over its knee, and make somebody stumble out of a temple asking, what the hell are they supposed to do with their life now? We've removed atrocity, which is good, and then apparently decided that the safest way to stop atrocity from returning was to remove the voltage too. Amputate all of it. It's far too dangerous. So we sterilized goodness. We sterilized it until it could no longer carry erotic charge, danger, consequence, ferocity, sacrifice, terrible splendor, or meaningful transformations. And then we stood here bewildered, where you see millions of people wandering away from the bloodless heaven that we offered them. And they went searching for hell. Because whatever else hell may be, hell at least appears capable of changing the temperature in the fucking room. That's the question that opened this whole chamber of inquiry for me. And I'm not talking about, every rap song as though an entire art form born from rhythm, protest, comedy, reporting what's going on, invention, and survival can be just reduced to one pathology. I'm talking about the most popular forms, though. And here today, I'm not talking about every written novel for women as though the female imagination was just one enormous mafia boyfriend wearing 6 million trench coats. I'm talking about the coercive prestige that has become enormously profitable inside gangster rap and female-authored dark romance novels. This reoccurring glamour of the man who takes whatever he can reach, and the woman whose value is proven because dangerous power cannot resist rearranging the world around her. Why do these images carry so much voltage? Why does the artist who says, I can take whatever I can reach, so often sound more alive than the preacher who says, please remember to make healthy choices? What are people actually choosing when they choose these images? Are they choosing coercion Or are they choosing voltage because coercion has been allowed to monopolize it? Once I asked that question that way, the floor dropped out from underneath me because gangster rap and women's dark romance stopped looking like unrelated genres with a few unfortunate habits and began looking like mirror discharges from the same ancient power system. The masculine and feminine negotiations with an unresolved grammar older than any civilization capable of criticizing it. The coercive masculine fantasy says that the man becomes real in proportion to the amount of reality he can overpower. His enemy certifies importance, women certifies desirability, and money certifies his rank. In the neighborhood, well, that becomes a stage upon which he proves that he escaped powerlessness by becoming powerful enough to manufacture that in everyone around him. He does not merely want wealth, sex, or victory. He wants immunity from refusal. He wants the world to encounter his appetite as weather, something everybody must prepare for, while he remains exempt from the preparation himself. I take, therefore I am. It's not merely a lyric inside this fantasy, it is the metaphysics underneath the baseline itself. And then you have the narcissistic, dark, feminine fantasy novels. It answers from the other side. The other side of the same machine, I find. It says that women become real by becoming the one reality overpowering engine that no one can ignore. The singular creature for whom the dangerous man spends his ordinary contempt. He may be cruel to everybody else, regard the other women as disposable, terrify his servants, his enemies, former lovers, and strangers, and leave enough wreckage behind to qualify as a regional weather event. Yet his indifference to the rest of humanity can increase the emotional value of his recognition because every person he disregards magnifies the miracle that he sees in her. The man imagines that his power makes consent unnecessary, while the woman imagines that her desirability makes his loss of control inevitable. He becomes the irresistible force, and she becomes the irresistible object. And everybody outside their sacred circuit is demoted into evidence of this. Victims become scenery, rivals become offerings, the neighborhood becomes production design, former girlfriends become a staircase of supposedly inferior women leading towards the heroine's throne. And the world may burn so long as the couple gets to stand in the flames looking magnificent and sexually moisturized. That is not love defeating narcissism. That is narcissism achieving a romantic merger and filing joint taxes. I think we need to stop being polite about how dangerous this is. Because narcissism is not merely vanity or confidence or beauty, ambition, self-love, eroticism, enjoying one's reflection, or posting one too many photographs from the gym. Narcissism is a governing structure in which only one center of reality fully receives weight. Other people may be useful, attractive, or obedient to them, threatening, inconvenient, or passionately loved. But they're never permitted to remain fully real when their reality interferes with the protagonist's hunger. Narcissism itself is not simply one psychological disorder. It is the oldest leadership model power knows. The tyrant does not need to believe that other people lack inner lives. He merely needs them to believe that their inner lives have become irrelevant when they obstruct his project. The coercive man may feel tremendous emotion. He may rage, worship, and guard and desire, mourn, and even kill with such intensity that a healthy person wonders whether they are underperforming romance. But intensity does not prove recognition. A person can experience another human being with overwhelming emotional force while still using that human being as an instrument through which the self becomes visible. The same moral scrutiny has to fall upon the narcissistic feminine fantasy with equal weight. Because a Mesa that examines masculine darkness with a microscope and then wraps feminine darkness in soft padded gauze has already become Newman locked. A woman may believe that she has discovered the hidden tenderness beneath a dangerous man's cruelty. She may believe she alone understands the wound that made him brutal. She may even experience his obsession as evidence that she has reached some secret chamber of his soul that no other woman was beautiful enough for, patient, wounded, or sexually exceptional enough to enter. She may call this redemption. But what exactly has been redeemed here? Has he learned to recognize human life? Or has she merely secured private membership in the ruling class of his own contempt? If he remains predatory toward everybody else except her in the novel, she has not destroyed the empire of domination. She's become its favorite citizen. That is erotic exceptionalism. It says, I do not need power to possess the communion kernel. I only need power to recognize me. And holy fucking shit, is that dark. It doesn't ask the dangerous man to become good. It asks him to be secretly devoted to her alone. His cruelty towards other people may even increase her prestige. If he's respected every woman's boundaries, how would she know that his restraint around her was caused by the splendor of her specialness rather than something tedious like moral character? That right there, the coercive masculine pattern and the narcissist feminine pattern, are therefore not moral opposites here, but they're sexually differentiated positions inside the same ancient grammar. One seeks reality by overpowering it. The other seeks reality by becoming the one object overpowering power cannot ignore. The man wants his inability to govern himself interpreted as passion and strength, while the woman wants that inability to govern himself caused by her. And together, they form a perfect catastrophe in which domination supplies the evidence of potency and exceptional treatment supplies the evidence of worth. This is coercive prestige. Not merely the appearance of force inside art, but the distribution of glamour in such a way that domination, disposability, humiliation, than anything capable of carrying responsibility. Coercion receives the best lighting because it still knows how to make an entrance. The coercive man gets the strongest beat. The dangerous lover receives the magnificent entrance. The gangster possesses the wealth, women, cars, the threat, jewelry, quotable lines, and gravitational field of the whole production. And then the stalker receives mystery and erotic cinematography, while the decent person becomes a beige obstacle who says something about communication before the story politely removes him from the competition. The declared moral may tell us coercion is dangerous, but the camera tells us coercion is magnificent. And the nervous system usually remembers the camera. This is why the problem cannot be reduced to explicit lyrics or stated lessons. Formation occurs through the distribution of glamour. A song does not need to command imitation when it can simply make the coercive person appear more alive than everybody else, more interesting. And a romance novel, well, it doesn't need to announce that the stalking proves devotion when it can give stalking 300 pages of erotic consequence, while the ordinary trust receives the emotional energy of somebody remembering to buy dish soap at the store. This brings me back to church rock, because church rock is what happens when a culture recognizes that atrocity is dangerous, but it also has no idea how to recover the power atrocity stole, the voltage of it. Like, sure, the church removes predation, but it also removes teeth. It removes domination, but it also removes the danger and excitement. It removes erotic corruption, but often removes the body so thoroughly that one begins to suspect salvation requires becoming a polite fog that gets whisked around the wind. The drums sound as though they sound some kind of fucking non-aggression pact. The guitars rise heroically toward abso-fucking-lutely nothing. And the lyrics assure us that God commands galaxies, while suggesting he would become uncomfortable if anybody danced too hard. This is covenant without voltage. It is limp dick transcendence. And I'm not just merely insulting an ownership of nearly every image associated with strength, danger, polarity, consequences, status, surrender, ferocity, and unambiguous desires. People may not always be choosing coercion over covenant. They may be choosing charge over sterility, because culture has failed to show them covenant with voltage. That is the golden snitch hiding underneath this entire argument. The darkness is carrying stolen goods, because strength and danger and magnificence, devotion, our consequences, the masculine force and feminine desirability have all been smuggled into coercive images until respectable culture begins behaving as though the only way to remove the atrocity is to abandon everything powerful that traveled inside of it. Because we became frightened of appetite, of our aggression and sovereignty, of what surrender is, energies to the people least qualified to govern them, and then pointed towards the catastrophe as proof we know power itself here. Power, as I've outlined in other videos, is failing here. Power that is unable to perceive another center of experience is failing. A civilization that cannot metabolize human power cannot endure reality. Entertainment, it is smoke escaping from a deeper war inside the human animal. Power taking what power can may be one of the oldest images that life knows. Because long before human beings developed vows, consent doctrines, courts, therapy, philosophy, or language sophisticated enough to discuss something like the communion kernel, organisms were already competing. They were mating, they were guarding, coercing, bonding, fleeing, submitting. Not the only ancient inheritance, aligned rival inheritances in which predator and guardian consciousness desperately tries to determine which one should be allowed to pull the levers and operate the machinery we find ourselves in. So, what the hell does that mean? Well, it's something I've discovered or made up or synthesized or whatever. And specifically, incarnated sapience begins when life becomes conscious enough to stop mistakes, but did not give every capacity the final vote. We've got some people call that God. Some people call that in our DNA, opportunistic seizures, territorial possession, attachment to dangerous power, and cohesion under coercive conditions. It may respond to symbols the reflective person morally rejects. It may feel a pull towards darkness, not because darkness is good, but because darkness once carried all this intense voltage and initiation and consequence, protection even. Status and belonging informs the nervous system learned to recognize before the conscience was capable of asking whether those forms produced a world worth living in. The body is not lying when it recognizes the voltage. It uses the atrocity. The confusion begins because modern people are handed no chamber in which these truths can meet. They're told either that every desire is their sacred, authentic self, or that the desire proves they're secretly diseased, sinful, leaving one side to flatter the inheritance and the other to shame it, while neither develops the courage or the instruments required to form real human power. This is where self-loathing grows. It's where it lives. A person discovers that the body can become charged by the image the spirit refuses to enthrone. And because modern morality often provides no language whatsoever beyond affirmation or condemnation, the person concludes that some secret animal truth has exposed them as fraudulent, that they may desire equality, but then imagine surrender. They may believe in consent and feel drawn to danger. They may despise domination while feeling magnetized toward the person most likely to dominate the room or them. Then shame begins eating the bridge between the body and the spirit. And whatever cannot be spoken returns through culture wearing a leather jacket, chains, holding a gun, buying a penthouse, or whispering that the right monster would destroy everybody else just to prove how special you are. The unformed energy does not disappear if you censor it. It goes looking for a myth capable of carrying it underground. Coercive prestige wins because it is waiting at the door with excellent production value. Perhaps this is why ancient songs so often beg for hell. I don't mean this is like some sort of tidy historical law. Ancient people also sang about conquest, revenge, and the joy of smashing their enemies. Because apparently, humanity's never really lacked that enthusiasm for volunteers of that genre. I mean it as a diagnostic image. People living amid famine, invasion, disease, blood, and screaming may dream of gardens of infinite bread and start dreaming about the apocalypse. Gangsters, warlords, captors and monsters that nobody has initiated in them into a form of goodness that possesses consequences. A bloodless heaven can begin to feel like an endless waiting room. Hell at least contains the weather. The answer is not to send humanity back into hell so it can feel alive. The answer is to build a heaven with thunder inside of it. To build that heaven, we need to understand the war of the two fuels. The old fuel is narcissistic extraction. It creates local power by diminishing the reality around it. The conqueror becomes larger because the conquered becomes smaller. The predator feels potent because the victim's agency becomes irrelevant. The narcissistic heroine becomes uniquely valuable because everybody else outside the enchanted pair becomes narratively disposable. Then the gangster becomes mythic because his neighborhood remains wounded enough to authenticate his danger. This fuel is efficient in the short term because it coordinates through fear. It resolves uncertainty through domination and converts ambiguity into hierarchy. Nobody has to understand anybody else. The strongest will decides, and everyone downstream learns to adapt, to submit, to imitate, or they disappear. Human history contains mountains of evidence that this fuel works, and that's why everybody reaches back to it in uncertain times. It builds kingdoms, it coordinates armies, it accumulated resources and raised monuments enormous enough to make later generations briefly forget how many backs and lives are beneath the stones. The old fuel works, but it leaves craters because it produces spectacular local voltage by exporting suffering into everyone outside the victorious center. It hands the bill to the conquered, to the abandoned, to the just another catchy lyric before the mother had to finish burying them. Perhaps this fuel once propelled vast portions of human progress. And saying that does not mean atrocity was secretly good, or that violence was necessary, that conquest was holy, or that slavery was an unfortunate but useful internship on humanity's resume. No, it means something colder. Coercion was often an available coordination technology in worlds where survival margins were thin. Institute uncertainty before understanding arrived to save people. Fear could move bodies when trust had not been built. Territorial force could preserve resources long enough for somebody to inherit them. The old fuel carried brutal adaptive intelligence, which is precisely why simply calling it stupid or evil has never been enough to remove its hand from the controls. But times have changed. The spear has become the nuclear weapon. The village rumor has become the planetary algorithm. The charismatic narcissist can enter millions of nervous systems without putting shoes on. The territorial primate now has satellites, while the wounded adolescent is beginning to inherit biotechnology. The species that still answers status anxiety by publicly humiliating rivals has started creating artificial minds, autonomous weapons, Genetic tools and machines capable of multiplying decisions faster than consciousness or conscience can inspect them. This changes the scale of the old argument completely. We now possess godlike power, while our formation systems remain barely qualified to supervise a middle school cafeteria. And although we know how to manufacture power, to accelerate it, to distribute and automate it, commercialize and put it into the hands of whoever secures funding first, we do not know how to reliably produce beings capable of carrying what we invent without turning the machinery into an amplifier for whatever they never metabolized. Technology itself does not rescue an unformed organism. It magnifies the organism and removes the mercy of small consequences. The narcissist with a spear may terrorize a family. The narcissist with an army may terrorize a country. And the narcissist with an algorithm may occupy the attention of an entire civilization. But once artificial intelligence, engineered diseases, automated weapons, and planetary infrastructure enter their reach, the inability to recognize other centers of reality can become an extinction mechanism. The truly terrifying thing is that intelligence will keep rebuilding the machines. Even after collapse, somebody will eventually find the fragments, ask how it worked, and begin the climb again. Which raises the question I cannot stop circling around. How many times might intelligence have reached this gate? On how many other worlds? On this world that we stand upon? How many civilizations became brilliant enough to tear matter open, but never wise enough to ask what sort of creature should be permitted to hold that knife? Perhaps none have gone before us. Maybe the universe is full of dead geniuses. Either way, the bottleneck remains the same. Can power learn to recognize anything beyond itself? This is why incarnated sapience is actively at war with narcissism. Not at war with appetite, dominance, surrender, beauty, ambition, aggression, or intensity, but at war with the ancient narcissistic claim that these energies become powerful only by reducing someone else's reality. The communion kernel I propose is another fuel. It begins with the terrible recognition that another center of experience remains real even when it frustrates your desire. Your refusal does not become meaningless because someone's aroused. Your weakness does not become permission because they are strong. And your future does not become expendable just because you're afraid. Admiration does not prove divinity. Your pain does not become scenery because someone's story has a fantastic soundtrack. At first, this fuel appears weaker because it cannot seize the shortest path, the quickest. It must perceive, tolerate complexity, and remain conscious while still carrying a voltage and a charge that means anything to people. The tyrant needs enough force to overcome resistance. The covenantal person needs force and the additional capacity not to become possessed by it. Predation is cheap voltage. Communion is difficult voltage. That's why so many modern good people feel limp. We developed future responsibility. Outread became bureaucratic, bloodless, doesn't know how to dance, incapable of inspiring anybody whose pulse remained detectable. Blue knows how to build a bridge. But sometimes forgets why anyone wanted to cross the river in the first place. It knows how to establish boundaries, but sometimes speaks as though desire itself were an embarrassing administrative malfunction. It knows how to prevent catastrophe, but not always how to produce magnificence. Red remembers magnificence. Red knows about appetite and blood and danger and sovereignty, the erotic forces, what fury feels like, what descending into the darkness is, and transformation, and the animal intelligence telling us life without teeth is not fully alive. Red refuses the lie that spiritual development requires castration. It understands why people need music that hits hard enough to rearrange your whole posture, why lovers want to encounter strength large enough to make surrender meaningful, and why civilizations without initiation begin fantasizing about apocalypse simply to feel that actions have consequence again. Red without blue, however, becomes the old nightmare in ceremonial clothing, because appetite begins declaring itself as revelation. Violence becomes masculinity. Desirability becomes moral authority. And the coercive man needs the neighborhood to remain wounded so his image can remain authentic. And the narcissistic woman, well, she would rather become the monster's exception than demand a world in which the monster recognizes everybody and doesn't hurt them. Red remembers the fire, but forgets the future, while blue remembers the future, but forgets the fire. And neither current can carry the 21st century alone. They must braid together. Not through some pathetic fucking compromise in which both surrender half their force and become pleasantly reasonable, but through the creation of a new energetic compound capable of doing what neither can accomplish separately. That compound is purple. Covenant with voltage. Force that remains conscious. Surrender without disappearance. Command without wide annexation. And desire immense enough to shake the walls while still recognizing that another universe is looking back through your beloved's eyes. This purple synthesis is the powerful man whose strength has found a vocation larger than performance. He does not prove masculinity by creating casualties or collecting women, humiliating his rivals, or keeping everyone around him emotionally dependent on his weather. He proves it through the amount of chaos he can enter without becoming chaotic himself, through the futures that remain standing because his ability to hear no without experiencing another person's reality as an attack on his own existence. Purple is the powerful woman whose worth does not depend upon becoming the singular exception to a dangerous man's contempt. She does not require ruined rivals, weakened men, or private monsters to reflect her magnitude. She does not call it redemption when predatory power remains predatory toward everyone else except her. Her charge expands reality rather than converting the surrounding world into a stage upon which her exceptional desirability is confirmed. This does not mean men must become harmless or women must become modest little lanterns politely illuminating male moral development. It means that both sexes must surrender their narcissistic belief that power becomes real only when somebody else becomes less real. Men must confront the coercive masculine fantasy honestly, not with another lecture informing them that aggression is toxic, but by entering the chamber and asking what the aggression is trying to become. Is the man actually hungry for cruelty? or for consequence? Does he want endless sexual access or just proof that he matters? Does he desire domination or does he want relief from the memory of humiliation? Is he trying to become powerful or trying to guarantee that no one will ever make him feel powerless again? What honorable vocation could carry that force without requiring victims? A culture that cannot answer those questions will lose its men to whoever can make predation sound like an initiation rite. Now, women must confront the narcissistic feminine dark romance fantasy with equal honesty. The desire to be selected by dangerous power cannot be declared harmless merely because it appears between book covers. Nor can every criticism just be dismissed as misogyny by people who somehow believe women become equal only when they're granted exemption from moral examination. What is carrying the charge in these books? Is it overwhelming strength, unambiguous desire, relief from self command or responsibility, the fantasy of being uniquely seen, the hope that love can transform danger, or the darker wish to become the one person for whom danger remains magnificent because it is pointed outward at everyone else? Does the imagined man possess moral depth, or does his contempt for other women function as the ruler by which the heroine measures her specialness? Does the fantasy enlarge her capacity for communion or train her to interpret cruelty towards others as evidence of value toward herself? These questions are not attacks on men or women. They are what equal moral seriousness looks like. No group is served by being lied to about its dangerous patterns. Men do not become better when every coercive impulse is blamed on society until their agency totally evaporates. And women do not become freer when every destructive fantasy is recorded as empowerment and criticism is treated as a hate crime committed against the sacred feminine. Protection from moral examination is not respect. It is a beautifully upholstered form of infantilization. Incarnated sapience requires equal jurisdiction, which means bringing the masculine shadow and the feminine shadow into the same chamber, bringing the hand that wants to seize and the gaze that want to become the only thing that the hand cannot ignore, and refusing either the shame that drives them underground or the flattery that gives them a throne. The purpose is not to prove that men are predators or that women are narcissists. Building when nobody asks them to answer for the fruits they produce. Fantasy matters because fantasy is not meaningless private weather. Fantasy is a workshop of becoming. It rehearses emotional futures, attaches charge to symbols, and trains bodies and imaginations to recover certain forms of danger as love, certain forms of surrender as worth, certain forms of violence as masculinity, and certain forms of exceptional treatment as feminine triumph. We understand this everywhere except where honesty frightens us. We understand that science fiction builds imaginative landing pads for technology like Star Trek and cell phones and even warp drive we're working on. That political myths prepare populations for sacrifice or war, and that religious images can shape civilizations for centuries. Yet when sexual fantasy appears, people suddenly insist imagination possesses no formative power because they fear that acknowledging its power will be used as an excuse of actual coercion. That is cowardice disguised as protection. Fantasy does not mechanically dictate action, but it does supply emotional scripts and influence what appears charged, forgivable, inevitable, or worthy of incarnation through us. The question is not whether somebody is permitted to imagine darkness, but what future darkness is rehearsing, what stolen good it carries, and whether the person possesses enough interpretive jurisdiction to separate the fire from the atrocity. This is the doctrine of unstolen fire. The recognition that coercion does not acquire rightful ownership of strength, of our danger, our aggression, surrender, darkness, this erotic intensity, masculinity, or feminine charge merely because it carried those energies first and learned how to make them look magnificent. The tyrant does not own strength. The predator does not own danger. The murderer does not own aggression. The owner does not own submission. And the woman who can feel valuable when somebody destroys the world for her does not own feminine radiance. The darkness is carrying stolen goods. And our task is not to burn the entire caravan in a panic and congratulate ourselves for removing temptation. Our task is to take the goods back. That is why censorship alone will always fail. You cannot defeat the vampire by offering a tax accountant. You cannot remove the gangster and replace him with a guidance counselor whose principal superpower is using the phrase, "I hear what you're saying." You cannot tell men that aggression is toxic while offering their aggression no sacred, difficult, and socially honored vocation. You cannot tell women in the same breath that desiring a formidable man that is strong is politically suspicious while offering the men trained to treat every form of decisiveness, embodiment, and polarity as a potential human resources violation. You can't just confiscate the fire and expect gratitude for the ashes. The answer is competitive myth making. We must build something hotter, something sexier, something alive and charged. And not hotter because it produces more casualties, but hotter because it can carry more reality without collapsing into coercion. The replacement must be hotter and sexier than the script it defeats, which means music where masculine strength is measured by the amount of disorder a man can metabolize without exporting it into women, into children, into neighborhoods, and romance where the dangerous man does not become worthy merely because one woman's persuaded him to spare her, but because love expands his capacity to recognize life wherever it may appear. Feminine power that does not require weaker women as comparison bodies or broken men as worship engines. Masculine restraint that looks like concentrated capacity rather than fear of embodiment. Vows that feel dangerous because they truly bind power to the future. And for the love of God, church music that sounds as though heaven contains some fucking weather in it. This is not a request for cleaner propaganda with a heavier guitar tone. It is a demand for stories in which covenant actually costs something, where power remains visible, temptation retains its teeth, and the future is protected not by pretending darkness is absent, but by forming people capable of entering darkness without becoming its employees of the month. Now I'd like to broach a little more controversial, heavy topic about all of this. This is where BDSM, ritual, myth, art, and deliberate relational practice may become civilizational laboratories rather than mere private eccentricities. Now, what the fuck am I talking about? Well, they can sometimes function as compatibility layers between ancient circuitry and conventional jurisdiction, permitting the body to encounter hierarchy, restraint, surrender, danger, or overwhelming force, while a deeper agreement preserves personhood. Revocability, if you change your mind, and responsibility for the well being of others. That does not make every enactment in those worlds healthy. Sometimes it's reopening old wounds that people refuse to face, and they feel the charge of these things and become addicted to it. That is the shadow of that. But also, a ritual can integrate an old circuit or strengthen a wound. Consent is the gate, not the fruits test of what it's actually producing or doing. But the possibility matters because it suggests to us we're not limited to repression or surrender. We may be able to enter a theater of coercion, retrieve the voltage, and refuse to let coercion become the political truth of the entire encounter. We may be able to teach the body that intensity can arrive without abandonment, and teach the spirit that safety does not require becoming bloodless and boring. So this is the purple wager. It can now be stated as the question beneath all other questions. Can communion release more energy than conquest? And I don't mean whether communion can produce a kinder pamphlet or a more peaceful afternoon. I mean whether trust can become more consequential than fear. Whether love can enlarge reality instead of constructing a private bunker for two narcissists surrounded by expendable humanity. Where powerful men can become more magnificent through the worlds protected by their strength rather than the bodies stacked behind them. And whether powerful women can become more radiant through the amount of reality their presence awakens rather than the number of people made invisible to confirm their specialness. Can surrender become deeper because personhood remains intact? And can authority become greater because it answers to life? Can we create beings capable of carrying godlike power and machinery without returning to the emotional logic of the ape with a larger rock? These are not decorative philosophical questions. They are the engineering questions for the human soul and the machinery that we're already running. I believe this is the primary bottleneck of humanity and sapience across the universe. Not whether we can invent the future, because we will invent, but whether formation can finally catch up with intelligence. I do not know how many times consciousness may have reached this threshold we find ourselves at, climbing from hunger into knowledge, from knowledge into machinery, and from machinery into a godlike reach into the stars before discovering it's too late, that it had been built engines with no formation system at a threshold now, and that the old fire. Coercive rap and narcissistic dark romance may not be the death throes of coercive prestige. They may be its campaign speeches. The old gods reminding us that they still know how to make the room shake, while the covenant is backstage asking whether anybody remembered the fucking capo. So, what would be a better amplifier? What would that actually be? Well, I don't think it would be another abstract philosophy sitting safely on a shelf somewhere, collecting dust, while coercive prestige owns the speaker. Beings receive the glamour of the culture. The mesa of life becomes only useful when its instruments operate as living organs inside of that ecology. The communion kernel, keeping another center of reality visible when appetite swells large enough to eclipse it. The fruits test, following every beautiful energy downstream to discover what kind of world and future that actually produces. Newman lock, exposing the moment narcissism declares itself innocent and persecuted because reality refused to kneel to it. And golden snitches, retrieving the decisive clue from whatever chamber everyone has agreed to leave politely unopened. Red must remain present because civilization without its appetite, danger, sovereignty, and embodied force becomes too weak to defend life. While blue must remain present because appetite without architecture eventually eats the altar, the worshippers, and itself. Purple is not one more item in that cabinet. Purple is what happens when the guitar catches fire and you can't help yourself from dancing under the covenant of goodness towards other people. That braid requires a refusal deep enough to cut in both directions. Intensity can no longer be surrendered to whoever is most willing to destroy somebody with it. But morality can no longer be surrendered to people who believe goodness should resemble a fucking dental office waiting room. Masculine darkness cannot be examined under, nor can feminine narcissism be exposed while masculine predation is excused as natural rigor with a better haircut. Narcissism has retained leadership for so long, paperwork and apologizing for the inconvenience of reading. The work is to change that distribution of prestige until red and blue are no longer competing religions inside the same nervous system. Until purple can burn brightly enough that appetite learns to carry reality, surrender retains authorship, authority recognizes the commanded, and strength no longer needs that cannot metabolize human power, cannot the machine we are already force we've ever inherited. The old world whispers that leadership means standing over somebody, that love means becoming someone's exception, that intensity requires victims, and that a person becomes real by making another person less real. The mesa of life wagers that this is not the final fuel, that we are not fucking done yet. It wagers that communion can become hotter and sexier than conquest itself, and that the vow can carry far more voltage than possession could have ever dreamed of, that men and women can confront their mirrored narcissistic shadows without retreating into the same propaganda or tradition, and that life itself can become conscious enough to govern the powers it keeps creating. That is where we go from here. Not back into the cave to call the blood on the wall authenticity, and not forward with a paving crew over everything that's alive. Fluorescent lights and policy declaring that nobody ever felt anything powerful inside the darkness. We enter with a lantern, a bell to call out the bullshit, a sense of humor, and enough nerve to ask the monster what it stole and confront it. Then retrieve the strength, the danger, the erotic charge, our sacred seriousness, surrender, aggression, devotion, and magnificence it's been holding hostage for far too long. We build our songs, our stories, vows, and formations capable of carrying those energies without requiring human beings to become scenery. We build a heaven with thunder in it. And because a civilization that cannot metabolize human power cannot endure reality, we wager that the communion can become hotter than conquest, and that the vow can carry more voltage, and that life can become conscious enough to finally govern the powers it creates. We keep the fire. The atrocity can go back. Then perhaps for the first time, we can find out how far we may really be able to fly together.